It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Willow Creek, the kind of day where time seemed to slow down. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the empty highway. The gas station, tucked between two old diners, was the only stop for miles, and today, like every other day, it looked peaceful. Cars came and went in a slow rhythm, the occasional hum of an engine breaking the stillness. Frank and Mary Thompson, in their late 60s, were the type of couple who had grown accustomed to the peaceful, predictable life of Willow Creek. Frank was a retired mechanic, his hands still strong and steady despite his age. His gray beard and weathered face told stories of hard work and decades spent in the same small town. Mary, his wife, was a gentle soul, the kind of person who smiled at everyone she met and made friends with strangers in an instant. They had been married for over 40 years, and their love was something that had withstood the test of time. On this particular day, they were at the gas station, filling up their aging sedan. Frank was busy with the pump while Mary stood by the car door, chatting with the friendly clerk behind the counter. It was a typical errand for them, nothing out of the ordinary. The steady hum of the gas station and the quiet chirp of distant birds filled the air. Mary absent-mindedly smoothed her skirt as she chatted with the clerk, unaware of the two motorcycles approaching in the distance. The sound of roaring engines grew louder, and Frank turned just in time to see the two bikers speeding toward the gas station. They were a stark contrast to the calm, slow-paced atmosphere of the town. Their motorcycles rumbled like thunder, their engines shaking the ground beneath them as they came to a screeching halt near the pumps. The bikes were massive, with chrome tanks and black leather seats that seemed to glisten in the afternoon sun. The riders wore dark, intimidating helmets that hid their faces, but their posture was enough to make anyone feel uneasy. Frank frowned as he glanced at the bikers, feeling a slight unease crawl up his spine. It wasn't that he was afraid, he had seen all sorts of characters pass through Willow Creek over the years. But something about these bikers seemed different. They exuded a sort of menace, their presence unsettling in a way that made the air feel heavier. One of the bikers, a tall man with a broad frame, dismounted with a grunt. He was dressed in a torn leather jacket, his pants covered in dirt and grime. His boots hit the pavement with a loud thud as he strode toward the gas pump, his eyes scanning the area with a kind of cold calculation. The second biker, shorter but stockier, followed close behind. He grinned when he saw Frank, his teeth yellow and crooked behind the mask of his helmet. Without a word, the taller biker reached out and slammed his fist down onto the hood of Frank's car, the impact causing a loud bang that echoed in the quiet air. Frank jumped, startled by the sudden aggression. He looked at the biker, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. "What's the matter with you?" Frank asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. The biker didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he looked Frank up and down. "What's your car worth, old man?" he sneered, a cruel smile playing at the edges of his lips. "You think this junk can even make it out of here?" Frank's heart skipped a beat. He had dealt with his fair share of rude people over the years, but something about this encounter felt different. These men weren't just here for a quick pit stop. They were looking for trouble. Mary, hearing the commotion, turned her head, her eyes widening as she saw the two bikers standing so close to Frank. Her instincts kicked in. She had seen this look before. The look that said violence was in the air, and it was only a matter of time before it would be unleashed. "Leave him alone," Mary said firmly, her voice shaking but laced with a quiet defiance. The shorter biker, who had been watching the exchange with a smirk, took a step toward Mary. His eyes glinted with malice. "What did you say, lady?" he spat, his voice thick with contempt. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Mary's breath caught in her throat, but she stood her ground. "I said leave him alone. Whatever your problem is, it doesn't involve us." Frank could feel his pulse quickening. He knew things were escalating, and fast. The bikers weren't just rude, they were aggressive. The atmosphere around them was growing tense, thick with the kind of tension that made you feel like anything could happen. Frank glanced around the gas station, hoping to see someone who could step in, someone who could defuse the situation. But the place was empty, save for a few scattered cars parked far off in the lot. There was no one around to help. The first biker, who had remained silent up until now, stepped forward, his eyes darkening as he looked Frank up and down. "What's your name, old man?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. Frank took a step back, instinctively shielding his wife with his body. "Frank," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the anxiety rising in his chest. "Frank Thompson." "Thompson, huh?" The biker smiled, but it was a cruel smile. "What's your car worth, Frank Thompson? You think it's worth anything? You think you're worth anything?" The words hit Frank like a punch to the gut. He had heard insults before, but this felt different. The biker wasn't just insulting him, he was trying to break him. He was trying to make him feel small, insignificant. Mary reached for Frank's arm, her fingers trembling as she gripped it tightly. "Please, Frank," she whispered. "Just get in the car. We can leave. It's not worth it." Frank knew she was right. But he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't let these men push him around, especially not in front of his wife. He straightened up, his hand tightening around the gas pump nozzle, but before he could say anything more, a sharp voice broke through the tension. "Hey, what's going on here?" Frank's head snapped toward the source of the voice. Across the parking lot, hidden in the shadows behind a row of trees, a man stepped forward. His uniform was crisp, his boots gleaming under the sun. He wasn't just any cop, this was a man who knew how to handle situations like this. But he didn't approach them right away. Instead, he stood still, his eyes locked on the bikers, studying them carefully. Frank's heart skipped a beat as he realized the officer had been there the entire time, watching them from the shadows. The realization was like a cold splash of water. Frank wasn't sure if he felt relieved or more fearful. The officer wasn't rushing over to help. He wasn't stepping in to break up the confrontation. He was waiting. The bikers, sensing the shift in the air, looked over their shoulders at the officer. For a brief moment, their confidence wavered. But they didn't leave. Instead, they exchanged a quick glance and then turned back to Frank, their smirk still in place. The officer, still standing behind the trees, never moved a muscle. His sunglasses hid any trace of emotion, but Frank could feel the tension growing. What was the cop waiting for? Was he just watching, or was he preparing for something? Frank couldn't tell. The biker who had been taunting him stepped forward again, his hand resting on his waist, where Frank knew a knife or a gun might be hidden. "You really think you can stop us, officer?" he sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. The cop didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken words. The bikers stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. They weren't used to being watched, not like this. And then, just as things seemed like they were about to reach their breaking point, the officer did something unexpected. He took a step forward, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. His stance was calm but firm. He wasn't rushing into the fray, but it was clear he wasn't going to let this continue. Frank, heart pounding, could only watch as the officer moved closer. The bikers seemed to hesitate, their bravado slipping. They didn't know who this cop was, but they could feel the power in his presence. And just like that, the tension in the air shifted again. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the scene, its golden rays now tinged with an eerie crimson. Frank's heart thudded painfully in his chest, the rush of adrenaline making everything around him seem distant and surreal. He watched the officer, his every step measured, as though he were calculating every move, every breath in the tense moment. The bikers were still, eyes flicking between Frank and the officer. There was a brief but telling hesitation in their movements, as though they were trying to assess the situation. It was a power struggle, an unspoken contest of wills. Frank could see it in their eyes. The bikers didn't want to back down, but neither did they want to test the cops' resolve. The officer's eyes never left them, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around him. Even the air seemed to grow still. His hand remained on his holster, not pulling a weapon yet, but the gesture alone was enough to make the bikers pause. Frank didn't know who the cop was, he had never seen him before, but in that moment, the officer felt like the only thing standing between him and a world of hurt. The tension between the two bikers and the officer felt thick enough to cut through with a knife. Frank's hands were slick with sweat, his mind racing. The last thing he wanted was a fight, but his instincts told him that if this situation wasn't handled carefully, it could escalate quickly. "What's going on here?" the officer asked again, his voice calm, measured, but firm. He didn't yell. He didn't demand answers in a way that would add to the chaos. His tone was authoritative but not overbearing. The taller biker, the one who had slammed his fist down on Frank's car, finally broke the silence. He stood tall, chest puffed out, trying to regain some of the bravado that had slipped in the face of the cop's calm but imposing demeanor. "Nothing, officer," the biker said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "We're just having a little fun, aren't we?" He shot Frank a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The officer didn't respond immediately, his gaze still unwavering, studying both bikers intently. Frank, standing there with his wife at his side, could feel the heat of the moment. His heart was pounding in his ears, and the silence felt suffocating. But what could they do? They were at the mercy of these men, or so it seemed. Mary, standing beside him, gripped his arm tighter. Her knuckles were white, her face pale, but her eyes never left the bikers. She wasn't sure whether to be scared or relieved by the officer's presence. She didn't trust these men, not even for a second. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, and she wanted nothing more than to leave, to get back in their car and drive away from this nightmare. But the cop wasn't acting like a typical lawman. He wasn't rushing in to arrest or to defuse. He was studying the situation, weighing his options. It was as if he knew something was about to unfold, something that no one expected. The shorter biker, who had been standing slightly off to the side, now spoke up. His voice was filled with a new level of aggression, as if his patience had worn thin. "Listen, cop, we didn't ask for you to get involved. So why don't you just turn around and walk away before things get ugly?" The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, but his stance remained unwavering. "I don't think you want to find out what happens when things get ugly," he said, the calmness of his voice making the words even more menacing. It was clear he wasn't intimidated, but the bikers didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't acting like the usual cop who would bark orders and try to end the conflict quickly. Frank watched as the bikers exchanged glances, their expressions flickering with uncertainty. It was clear that they had underestimated the officer. They had probably thought that a small-town cop wouldn't be much of a threat. But they were wrong. This officer wasn't intimidated by their posturing. The taller biker, sensing the shift in power, straightened up. "What's your name, officer?" he asked, his voice now tinged with more uncertainty than before. The officer didn't immediately answer. Instead, he took a step closer, his boots making a soft crunch on the gravel beneath them. Frank could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as the cop's shadow fell over him, the authority radiating from him as though he had the situation under control. But Frank wasn't so sure. There was something in the air, something that told him this wasn't going to end without a major confrontation. "It doesn't matter who I am," the officer replied finally, his voice steady. "What matters is that you two are about to make a decision. You walk away, or I make sure you regret staying." The bikers didn't respond right away. Frank could see them faltering, their defiant energy fading. But just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, the shorter biker let out a bark of laughter, though it was thin and hollow. "You think you can intimidate us?" he scoffed. "We've dealt with worse than you." His eyes darted toward his companion, who gave him a brief, almost imperceptible nod. Frank's gut twisted as he watched the exchange. He didn't know what they were planning, but he could feel the shift in the air. Something was about to break. Before Frank could react, the bikers turned in unison, their movements swift and synchronized, heading toward their motorcycles. The tension seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by a strange calm that left Frank feeling uneasy. Had they given up? Or was it a trap? The officer didn't move, still standing at the edge of the gas station, his eyes trained on the two men. The bikers reached their bikes, their hands hovering near the handles, but they didn't immediately start the engines. Instead, they looked back at the officer, sizing him up once again. "We're not done here," the tall biker called out, his voice low and filled with menace. "You think you've won? You've just made a mistake, officer." The officer didn't flinch. "You've already made your mistake," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But I'm giving you a chance to make it right." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the sound of a distant engine broke through the silence. Frank's head whipped around. A second squad car was pulling into the parking lot, this one unmistakably marked with flashing lights. The second officer stepped out, his hand resting on the radio of his uniform, ready for whatever situation they might face. The bikers froze, their faces paling as they recognized the situation spiraling out of their control. Frank could feel a wave of relief wash over him, but he wasn't ready to trust it completely. This was far from over. The new officer, a woman in her early 30s, looked at the scene with a practiced eye. She didn't hesitate. She immediately surveyed the situation and made her approach toward the first officer, who gave her a brief nod. The two seemed to communicate without words, their partnership seamless, as if they had been doing this for years. "What's going on here?" the second officer asked, her voice sharp but professional. The shorter biker opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, the first officer spoke again. "These men have been harassing this couple," he said, his tone unflinching. "I've warned them, but they need to be dealt with." The second officer's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer to the bikers. "You two are lucky I'm not writing you up for harassment. But that's not the only thing you need to be worried about." Her voice was laced with authority, and Frank could see the bikers starting to crumble under the pressure. The taller biker swallowed hard, but he wasn't ready to back down yet. "You don't understand." "I don't care what you think you understand," the second officer cut him off. "You're both going to jail for disturbing the peace, harassment, and whatever else we find. And trust me, we'll find something." The tension reached its peak once again, but this time, the bikers knew they were out of options. They had no way out. They had been outsmarted, outmatched, and outlasted. As the officers began to handcuff the bikers, Frank let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He turned to Mary, her face pale but relieved, her hand still gripping his arm tightly. "I think we're going to be okay," Frank said softly. But as the police took the bikers away, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this encounter than he could see, something deeper, something that would unfold in the days to come. The hum of the police sirens faded as the bikers were driven away, their motorcycles now lying abandoned on the gravel parking lot, gleaming ominously in the late afternoon light. Frank stood frozen for a moment, his mind still reeling from the chaotic turn of events. The officer had stepped in just in time, but the tension that had gripped his heart had not yet completely dissipated. He didn't know what to feel, relief, anger, or something else entirely. Beside him, Mary was still holding onto his arm, her knuckles pale from the strength of her grip. Her eyes were wide, flicking between the two officers as they stood beside the police cars, talking in low voices. Frank could tell she was just as shaken as he was, her usual calm demeanor completely replaced by an unsettling silence. "We're okay," Frank whispered, more to himself than to Mary. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to feel like everything was all right, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. The bikers were gone for now, but something told him they wouldn't stay away for long. And the officer, there was something about him, something that didn't sit right. "I don't know, Frank," Mary said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've never seen anything like that before." They were so, she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Yeah," Frank agreed, staring at the police cars in the distance. "But it's over now. It has to be." The officers were finishing up their discussion now, one of them giving a signal to the other. The second officer, the woman who had arrived after the first, started walking toward Frank and Mary. "I know this was a scary situation for you too," the woman said, her tone soft but firm. "But everything's under control now. We've got them. They're not going anywhere." Frank nodded, but his thoughts were far from reassured. "Thanks," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "Are you sure it's over? I mean, those bikers didn't look like they were going to just let it go." The officer gave him a hard, calculating look. "They won't be back. Not without some serious consequences. We've got them on record, and we've got a few connections in the department who are looking into them." She paused, glancing toward her partner, who was taking down information from the bikers' bikes. "We'll make sure this doesn't turn into something worse." Frank wasn't sure what to make of her words. He could tell she was trying to comfort them, but he wasn't convinced. Everything had happened too quickly, and the way the bikers had reacted. He felt like there was something more going on. Something deeper. Mary's voice broke through his thoughts. "Is there any way to find out who they are? What they were doing here?" The officer hesitated for a moment before answering. "We'll be able to trace their records, but I wouldn't get your hopes up. They're well known in certain circles. We're talking about a group that's been involved in some questionable activities. But we'll look into it, no doubt." Frank felt a chill run down his spine. The bikers weren't just random troublemakers, they were part of something bigger, something far more dangerous. He felt it in his gut. It wasn't just a one-off encounter. This was a warning. "We'll be in touch if we need anything from you," the officer added, before turning and walking back toward the squad car. Frank and Mary stood in silence, watching the officers drive away. The hum of the engines faded, and all that was left was the slow, almost unbearable quiet. It felt like the calm before a storm. "We need to get home," Frank said, his voice low and firm. "Before anything else happens." Mary nodded, her eyes still wide. "Let's go." They made their way to their car, but as Frank opened the door, something caught his eye. There, on the ground near where the bikers had been standing, was something that hadn't been there before, a small, silver object. He bent down to pick it up, and his fingers brushed against cold metal. It was a key. A plain, unmarked key with no distinguishing features. Frank held it up, staring at it in confusion. "Mary, look at this." She leaned over, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" "I don't know." "A key. But to what?" Frank's mind raced. Could it be the key to one of the bikers' motorcycles? Or was it something else entirely? Before he could examine it further, he heard the sound of a car approaching. Another vehicle. This time, it wasn't an officer, just a normal car driving slowly down the road. Frank barely paid attention, his mind still focused on the key in his hand. But then, something caught his eye. In the driver's seat of the passing car, there was a man, his face partially obscured by sunglasses. He was looking directly at Frank. Frank's heart skipped a beat. The man's eyes were cold, calculating, almost predatory. The car sped up, disappearing into the distance. Frank stood frozen for a moment, the key still in his hand, his mind swirling with questions. Who was that man? And why had he been watching? "Frank, we should go," Mary said, her voice urgent. "We don't need to stick around here any longer." But Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something wasn't right. He couldn't explain it, but he knew it was true. They couldn't just leave. Not yet. He slipped the key into his pocket, still unsure of its significance, and helped Mary into the car. They drove in silence, the quiet punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the occasional passing car. But Frank's mind was far from silent. He kept thinking about the bikers, about the strange officer, about the man in the car. What had they been involved in? And why did it feel like they were just scratching the surface of something much darker? A few miles outside of town, Frank pulled the car onto a secluded dirt road that led to a small patch of forest they often used as a shortcut home. The road was empty, isolated, perfect for reflection. But as they drove deeper into the trees, something caught Frank's eye. A flash of movement, just off the side of the road. He slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the gravel as he brought the car to a sudden stop. "Frank?" Mary's voice was sharp with concern. "What's wrong?" Frank's heart was pounding again. He looked to his right, where he had seen the movement. At first, he saw nothing, just the shadows of trees and the faint glow of the setting sun. But then, he saw it again. A figure, standing at the edge of the forest. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadows. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching them. Frank's blood ran cold. This wasn't a coincidence. He knew it. "Mary, stay here," he said, his voice low but firm. He reached for the door handle, his fingers shaking. But before he could open the door, the figure in the forest vanished. Just like that. Gone. Frank's eyes scanned the trees, the silence around them thick and heavy. It was as if the world had stopped turning for just a moment. "Frank, let's just go," Mary said urgently, her voice trembling. "We're not alone. This isn't safe." Frank didn't need to be told twice. He slammed the car into reverse and pulled back onto the main road, his eyes scanning every inch of the trees behind them. But as they drove away, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching them. The road stretched endlessly before Frank as he kept his hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel. The car hummed steadily down the darkening highway, but Frank's mind was anything but calm. His nerves were frayed, the feeling of being watched pressing against him like a weight. The strange figure in the woods was still vivid in his mind, how he had vanished into the shadows with no trace, like he was never there to begin with. Mary's quiet voice broke through his thoughts. "Frank, what do you think is going on? Why did that man in the car stare at us like that?" Her voice trembled with the same unease Frank had been feeling ever since they left the gas station. Frank swallowed, trying to steady his racing heart. "I don't know. It's like we're being followed. Like everything's connected somehow." "You think those bikers were just a distraction?" she asked, her eyes wide with worry. He nodded, but even as he spoke, the question seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. It made sense, on some level, the bikers had shown up out of nowhere, creating chaos and fear. But why? And why did the officer, the strange cop who had intervened, act so differently? Why had the second officer, the woman who seemed to know what was happening, warned them like they had something to fear? But Frank's thoughts drifted back to the key, the simple, unmarked key that he still hadn't told Mary much about. It felt like a clue, a thread they could pull on, but he had no idea where it led. And even more confusing was the fact that the man in the car, the one who had watched them so intently, seemed to know something they didn't. "Maybe we should talk to someone about the bikers. Maybe someone in town knows who they are," Mary suggested, trying to make sense of it all. Frank took a deep breath, his hands tight on the wheel. I don't think this is something we can talk to anyone about just yet, Mary. Not until we understand what we're dealing with. Are we even sure we want to know what we're dealing with? She asked softly, glancing over at him. The truth of her words hit Frank hard. No, he wasn't sure they wanted to know. But they couldn't just let this go, could they? Something in him told him that if they did, they'd be walking right into something much worse. They drove in silence for a while, the streetlights of the small town just ahead, until Frank turned onto a small, narrow road that led toward their home. The house they'd built together. The house that was supposed to be a safe haven, a place to escape from the chaos of the world. But as Frank pulled into the driveway, he realized that home no longer felt like a sanctuary. I'll go check the mail, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Mary gave him a sharp look. Frank, are you sure you're okay? I'll be fine, he said, though he wasn't so sure. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the mailbox, trying to shake off the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. As he opened the mailbox, his eyes landed on a thick envelope with no return address. His breath caught in his throat as he pulled the envelope out. It was heavy, the paper thick and textured, and there was something about it that felt off. He turned it over in his hands, looking for any clue about who had sent it, but there was nothing. No name. No stamp. No markings of any kind. Just the envelope, sealed shut. A chill ran through him as he walked back to the car. He slid into the driver's seat, holding the envelope tightly, his mind racing with possibilities. What is it? Mary asked, noticing the envelope in his hands. I don't know, Frank said, his voice low. But we need to open it. He tore the envelope open, his heart thumping in his chest. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. On it, written in black ink, was a short but cryptic message. They know who you are. They know what you've seen. You're not safe. But you can't stop them. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. The words were simple, but the weight of them hit him like a freight train. His hands shook as he read it again, trying to make sense of it. Mary's voice was shaky as she leaned in. Who could have sent this? What does it mean? Frank didn't have an answer. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together everything that had happened so far. The bikers. The strange officer. The man in the car. The key. And now this ominous note. Everything was starting to feel like a tangled web, and the more Frank tried to pull at the threads, the more complicated and dangerous it seemed. There's only one way to find out, Frank said finally, his voice rough. We have to go back to the gas station. Mary's eyes widened in disbelief. Frank, are you serious? After everything that's happened, you want to go back there? We don't have a choice, he said, his jaw clenched. We need to know who's behind all of this. We need to understand what's really going on. Mary didn't argue, but Frank could see the hesitation in her eyes. She was scared, and he didn't blame her. He was scared too. But there was a fire inside him, something that told him they couldn't walk away from this. Not yet. He started the car, his grip firm on the steering wheel. The journey back to the gas station felt different now. Every mile seemed heavier, as if the weight of the mystery was pressing down on them with every passing second. They didn't speak as they drove, there was nothing more to say. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the tires on the road. As they neared the gas station, Frank's eyes scanned the area, his senses on high alert. He didn't know what he was looking for, but something told him that if they didn't find answers here, they might never find them at all. The gas station was quiet now, the lights casting long shadows across the parking lot. Frank parked the car, his heart pounding as he looked around. It was almost as though everything had gone back to normal, as if nothing had happened here only hours ago. But Frank knew better. Nothing was normal. And they were far from safe. He and Mary stepped out of the car, their footsteps echoing on the pavement as they approached the station. Frank's eyes were drawn to the area where the bikers had stood. The air felt thick with tension, as though the past events were still lingering in the atmosphere. And then Frank saw it. A motorcycle helmet, lying discarded in the dirt. He bent down and picked it up, his fingers brushing against the worn leather. There was something strange about it, a symbol etched into the side, a design he didn't recognize. It was subtle, hidden among the cracks and scratches of the helmet's surface, but Frank could see it now. A logo. A mark. "Mary, look at this," he said, holding it out to her. She took it from him, inspecting the symbol. "What is it?" "I've never seen anything like it." Frank's mind raced. He had no idea what the symbol meant, but it felt important. It was another piece of the puzzle, another clue they had to follow. Just then, Frank heard footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, his heart leaping into his throat. But it was only the officer, the same officer who had been there earlier, the one who had helped them. "Did you find something?" the officer asked, his voice low and steady, as if nothing had happened. As if everything were normal. Frank held up the helmet, showing him the symbol. "Do you recognize this?" The officer's expression remained unreadable, but Frank could see a flicker of something in his eyes, a glimmer of recognition, followed quickly by a mask of indifference. "No," the officer said, his tone neutral. "I've never seen it before." Frank didn't believe him, but he didn't push it. Not yet. There was something off about the officer, something that Frank couldn't quite place. But he had to focus. They needed to get to the bottom of this. He could feel it, the pieces were falling into place, one by one, but they were still a long way from the truth. "We'll find out what it means," Frank said, his voice resolute. "We have to." The officer nodded, his face hardening. "Just be careful, Frank. Things are getting dangerous. People don't always play by the rules, and some things are better left alone." But Frank didn't hear him. He had already turned his attention back to the symbol on the helmet. He knew they were on the edge of something much bigger, and he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth. The darkness of the night pressed in on them as Frank and Mary drove away from the gas station, the helmet still clutched in Frank's hand. The symbol etched into the side was like a burning question mark in his mind, one that he couldn't shake. He had to know what it meant, and he had to know now. Mary sat beside him in the car, her face pale as she stared out the window. She didn't speak, and Frank didn't force her to. He understood. They were both processing the events of the day, but it was clear they were both feeling the same gnawing sense of unease. The bikers, the strange officer, the cryptic note, and now the helmet, it was all leading them somewhere. But where? "Frank," Mary said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Do you think we're in over our heads?" He glanced at her, seeing the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just the events of today that had shaken her, it was everything that was still left unanswered. The questions were piling up faster than they could get answers. And the more they uncovered, the more danger seemed to loom just out of sight. "I don't know," Frank admitted, his voice low. "But we can't stop now. Not until we figure out what's really going on." Mary nodded, her gaze turning back to the road ahead. I don't know who we can trust anymore." That was the part that was starting to get to Frank, too. The feeling of being surrounded by shadows, of not knowing who was on their side, or if there was anyone they could truly trust. The officer, he seemed like he was trying to help, but there was something off about him. And now the symbol on the helmet, someone had gone to great lengths to make sure it was hidden, yet it was there, staring them in the face. "I'm going to find out what this symbol means," Frank said, his voice firm. "I don't care how long it takes." Mary turned to him, her expression a mixture of concern and resolve. "I know you want answers, Frank. But, what if we don't like what we find?" Frank didn't have a response for her. Part of him was afraid of what they might uncover. But the larger part of him knew they had no choice. The answers were out there, somewhere, and they were the ones who had to find them. They pulled into their driveway, the car's headlights briefly illuminating their quiet home. But as Frank parked the car and cut the engine, he felt a strange sense of dread. It wasn't the comfort of being home that he expected, it was as if the walls around them were closing in, as though something, or someone, was waiting for them. "We need to get inside," Mary said quietly, her voice tinged with worry. Frank nodded, and they both got out of the car. But as he reached for the front door, something caught his eye, a shadow moving across the front lawn. He froze, his hand still on the doorknob. Mary looked at him, following his gaze, but saw nothing. "What is it?" she asked, her voice sharp with fear. "I saw something," Frank said, his pulse quickening. Someone was just there. On the lawn. The next morning, Frank couldn't shake the heaviness that clung to him. The encounter last night, the mysterious figure in the yard, had left him feeling vulnerable. And yet, something told him that it wasn't just an isolated event. This was the start of something bigger. He sat at the kitchen table, the helmet still sitting in front of him, the symbol burned into his mind. Mary was busy preparing breakfast, her movements mechanical, her eyes distant. "We need to find out what this symbol means," Frank said, his voice filled with determination. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come after us." Mary nodded slowly, but Frank could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't want to go deeper into this, but she knew there was no turning back now. "I'll look into it," she said, though her voice was hesitant. "But what if we're making a huge mistake? What if this is more dangerous than we realize?" Frank reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you, Mary. But we have to understand what we're up against." She didn't say anything more, but he could tell she was thinking it through. They had to know who they were up against. The note. The symbol. The man in the yard. It was all connected. They spent the rest of the day researching, trying to find any clues that might lead them to answers. Frank scoured the internet for any mention of the symbol on the helmet, but there was nothing. No leads. No information. Just silence. It was like the symbol didn't exist. But that night, as they were about to give up, Frank received a call. It was an unfamiliar number, and he hesitated before answering. When he did, a cold voice greeted him on the other end. "I know you're looking for answers," the voice said, its tone smooth, like it had been practiced. "But be careful what you wish for. Some things are better left in the dark." The line went dead. Frank stared at the phone in his hand, his mind reeling. The voice sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. And the warning, it was like a shot across the bow. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop. But Frank wasn't backing down. Not now. The phone call had left Frank with a chill in his bones, the cold, unrecognizable voice still echoing in his mind. He tried to push it away, to focus on the task at hand, but the warning was clear: someone was watching them. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Frank had always prided himself on being a problem solver. Whether it was fixing things around the house or piecing together puzzles, he'd always believed in finding answers. But this? This was different. He wasn't just facing a problem that could be fixed with logic. This was something darker, something that twisted the very fabric of his reality. Mary had heard the call too, and she hadn't said much since. They'd spent the rest of the day in silence, trying to make sense of everything. But no matter how many times Frank searched for clues, everything seemed to lead to dead ends. The symbol on the helmet. The cryptic note. The figure in the yard. And now, the mysterious phone call. "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this," Mary said suddenly, breaking the silence as they sat at the kitchen table. We're in over our heads, Frank. I can feel it. Frank looked up from his laptop, meeting her gaze. I know. But we're not stopping now. We've come too far. Mary sighed, running her fingers through her hair. I don't want to be scared anymore. I just want things to go back to normal. But Frank knew that was impossible. Things hadn't been normal since the moment they pulled into that gas station. The very fact that they were still alive after everything that had happened told him that they were caught in something much bigger than they realized. He closed his laptop and stood up. We need to keep going. We need to go back to the beginning. Mary looked at him, confusion flickering across her face. The beginning? What do you mean? Frank's mind was racing. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. The key. The gas station. The officer. The bikers. The cryptic note. They were all connected, but the key was the first clue. The very thing that started all of this. He had no idea why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the key was central to everything. I'm going back to the gas station, he said, his voice steady. We missed something. I know it. Mary's expression softened with concern, but she didn't argue. She knew Frank couldn't stop, not now. They both had to know what was really happening. Okay, she said quietly. But we're in this together. You're not doing this alone. Frank smiled faintly at her, grateful for her support. I know. And I won't let anything happen to you. They got in the car, the same car that had been their only refuge through this entire ordeal. It felt like they were on a journey with no clear destination, just endless roads leading into the unknown. The gas station wasn't far, but the drive seemed to take forever. Each mile was like a countdown to something that neither of them could predict. When they finally reached the gas station, it was eerily quiet. The lights from the pumps flickered in the dark, casting long shadows across the lot. Everything seemed still, too still. Frank could feel the tension in the air, the sense that something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. He parked the car and got out, his footsteps heavy as he approached the small convenience store. Mary was close behind, but Frank could sense her unease. She wasn't just nervous, she was terrified. And Frank couldn't blame her. He was feeling the same way. As they stepped inside the store, the bell above the door chimed softly. The familiar scent of old coffee and dusty shelves filled the air, but there was something off about the place. The shelves seemed emptier than before, as if they had been hastily cleared out. The cashier, a young man who Frank had never seen before, looked up from behind the counter. His eyes were wide, and he seemed almost nervous. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. Frank studied him for a moment. The man looked like he was trying to act normal, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he knew more than he was letting on. "We're just looking around," Frank said, his voice casual but firm. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about a group of bikers that were here earlier, would you?" The man's eyes darted toward the door, as if he was expecting someone to come in. He seemed to hesitate before answering. "Bikers? I didn't see anything. Just a few regulars, that's all." Frank wasn't convinced. He could tell the man was lying, and it only made him more suspicious. He had to get to the bottom of this, and the clerk was the only person who could help them. "We're not here to cause trouble," Frank said, his voice calm but intense. "But we need to know what's going on. People are watching us, and we don't know why. Do you know anything about it?" The man's eyes flickered with fear, and for a brief moment, Frank thought he saw something, a flash of recognition, maybe even guilt. But before he could respond, the door opened with a sharp jingle, and two figures stepped inside. Frank froze as he recognized one of them immediately. It was the officer, the same one who had helped them at the gas station the night of the incident. The officer's gaze locked with Frank's, and for a moment, Frank saw something in his eyes that made him uneasy. It was the same feeling he'd had before, the feeling that the officer was hiding something. "Frank," the officer said, his voice low and steady. "Mary." Frank didn't respond immediately. He studied the officer, trying to read him. The man had been too calm the last time they met, and now he was acting almost cautious. Too cautious. "Are you here to help us?" Frank asked, his voice steady. The officer didn't answer right away. He turned to the clerk, giving him a sharp look. "We need to have a word with these two," he said, his tone demanding. The clerk nodded nervously and quickly ducked behind the counter, clearly eager to get out of the conversation. Frank didn't take his eyes off the officer. "Do you have any idea what's going on here?" Frank asked, his patience wearing thin. "We've been followed. We've been threatened. We don't know who we can trust." The officer looked around, as if making sure no one else was listening. "You don't understand," he said, his voice quieter now. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's bigger than that. You've crossed a line. And now, there's no going back." Frank felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, there's no going back? Who's behind this?" The officer's gaze flickered toward the door, and Frank followed his eyes. There was a man outside, standing by a black SUV, watching them intently. Frank could just make out his features in the dim light. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and dark sunglasses that hid his eyes. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, like a sentinel, waiting for something. The officer's face hardened. "You don't want to know who's behind this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Trust me. Some things are better left alone." But Frank wasn't going to back down. Not now. He stepped closer to the officer, his voice low and urgent. "Tell me what's going on. Who are they? What do they want with us?" The officer took a deep breath, his expression conflicted. For a moment, Frank thought he was going to tell him everything, the truth, the whole story. But then, the officer looked over his shoulder one last time, and in that moment, Frank knew something was wrong. The officer stepped back, his hand reaching for his gun. "Get out of here, now," he said, his tone sharp and commanding. "And don't come back." Before Frank could respond, the officer turned and walked out of the store, disappearing into the night. The door jingled softly behind him. Frank stood frozen, his mind racing. The officer's warning was clear. Whoever was behind this wasn't just dangerous, they were powerful. And they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. "We need to go," Frank said, his voice tense. "Now." But as they hurried toward the door, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, again. And this time, he wasn't sure they were going to make it out alive. The moon hung high above the road as Frank and Mary sped away from the gas station, their hearts pounding in time with the engine's growl. The officer's warning echoed in Frank's mind, a harsh reminder that they were now in a game far larger and more dangerous than they'd anticipated. The unknown forces pursuing them weren't just watching from the shadows anymore, they were actively trying to keep them in the dark, to silence them. "Do you think we're safe now?" Mary asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white, and Frank could see that her eyes darted around, searching for something she couldn't name, something lurking just beyond their sight. "I don't know," Frank said, his voice low. He had no answers for her. In truth, he didn't know if they would be safe for another minute, let alone until the sun came up. The officer's cryptic warning had unsettled him. The man had sounded genuinely afraid. And now, there was that mysterious figure standing outside the gas station, someone clearly waiting for them to leave, watching their every move. Frank couldn't shake the feeling that the entire night had been a setup. The officer's cryptic involvement, the strange phone calls, and now, these shadows, it was all building towards something he could barely comprehend. "We can't keep running," Frank muttered to himself, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. The thought of leaving their home and hiding out indefinitely didn't sit well with him. They needed answers. And the only way to get them was to face what was coming head-on. Mary glanced at him, her face pale but determined. "We have to. We don't know who we can trust anymore, Frank. Not even the police." Her voice faltered at the end, but she quickly steadied herself. "They're all connected somehow. All of them, the officer, the bikers, the man in the yard. They want something. But what?" Frank's thoughts were racing. He had thought about that too. They had started this entire mess by trying to do the right thing, by helping an elderly couple at the gas station. But now, their good intentions had dragged them into a nightmare of secrets, lies, and shadows, and he didn't know how to navigate through it all. The question had been nagging him for hours now: what do they want from us? He had to find out. He had to get to the heart of the mystery before they were consumed by it. "We need to go to the source," Frank said suddenly, as though a light had gone off in his mind. Mary raised an eyebrow. "The source? What does that mean?" "The symbol," Frank said, his voice gaining strength. "That helmet we found, the symbol on it. It's not just some random design. Someone went through a lot of trouble to hide it. And that means it's important. The bikers didn't just target us for nothing. Whoever they're working for, they want that symbol kept secret." Mary nodded slowly, her eyes wide as she realized the implication of what Frank was saying. "So, you think this symbol is the key to everything?" "I know it is," Frank said with absolute certainty. "But I need to find out where it's from. I need to know who put it there. And we need to find out why." They had already uncovered bits and pieces, the bikers, the officer, the ominous threats, but none of it made sense in the grand scheme of things. But Frank knew one thing: if they could figure out the symbol, they could figure out who was behind everything. And that was the only way to stop running. As they neared the edge of town, Frank spotted a sign for a small antique store. Something about it caught his attention. The old building was tucked away at the corner of a street, almost hidden behind overgrown trees and bushes, but the sign, faded and weathered, read, "Antique Curiosities." It was strange how his mind had immediately linked the store to the mystery at hand, but Frank didn't question his instincts. There was a pull, an unexplainable draw. Something about that store felt like it might hold a piece of the puzzle. "We're going to stop there," Frank said, veering off the main road. "I need to check something." Mary looked at him, a question in her eyes. "What are we looking for?" "I don't know," Frank said, his voice low. "But I feel like we're getting close. Just trust me." As he pulled into the parking lot, the store appeared to be closed, its windows dark and uninviting. But there was something about the place that seemed alive, something almost magical in the air. Frank knew they needed to trust that feeling. Whatever was inside, it might be the answer they'd been searching for. The bell above the door chimed softly when they entered, and the smell of dust and aged wood filled the air. The store was cramped, shelves stacked high with old books, antique furniture, and odd trinkets from a long-forgotten era. There were small tables with piles of maps, porcelain dolls, and glass figurines. Nothing in the store seemed to be ordinary, every item felt like it had its own story, a piece of history waiting to be discovered. At first, there didn't seem to be anyone around, but Frank's gaze was drawn to a figure sitting behind the counter in the far corner. It was an older man, his face wrinkled with age and experience, his glasses perched low on his nose as he flipped through a yellowed book. He looked up when they approached, his eyes glinting with curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice raspy but kind. "We were just looking around," Frank said, glancing at the shelves. "Actually, we're looking for something specific. A symbol, maybe something like a crest or insignia. Ever seen anything like that?" The old man's eyes narrowed slightly, and he set the book down, his fingers tapping the counter thoughtfully. "You won't find that kind of thing just anywhere," he said, his voice taking on a note of caution. "What kind of symbol are you talking about?" Frank hesitated. He didn't want to give too much away, but he needed the man's help. "It's an insignia that looks like," he paused, thinking carefully, "almost like an eagle, with wings spread wide." The old man's expression shifted. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. "Wait here," he said abruptly, before disappearing behind a curtain at the back of the store. Frank and Mary exchanged a look, their curiosity piqued. The atmosphere in the shop had suddenly shifted, as if they had crossed some invisible threshold. The old man had reacted to their request in a way that didn't seem normal. It was as if he knew exactly what they were talking about. Minutes passed before the man returned. He was holding an old, dusty book, its leather cover cracked and worn. The pages inside looked fragile, but he handled it with care. "This might be what you're looking for," the old man said, placing the book in front of Frank. The cover displayed intricate engravings, the same kind of intricate design that Frank had seen on the helmet. He could hardly believe it. "This book contains records, stories, legends, about various symbols used by groups and organizations throughout history," the man explained. "Some of them are harmless. Some, well, not so much. But the one you're talking about?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "It's not just any symbol. It's connected to something dangerous. Something old." Frank's heart skipped a beat. "Dangerous? What do you mean?" The old man looked around the shop cautiously before leaning in. "I don't know the full story, but I know enough to tell you this: if you're involved with that symbol, you're in way over your head. There are forces at play here that have been around a long time, and they don't let people go easily." Frank and Mary stood in stunned silence, the weight of the man's words settling in like a storm cloud. The truth was closer than ever, and it was darker than they had ever imagined. "Do you know where it leads?" Frank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man's face darkened. "I think you're already being led," he said ominously. "The rest of the story, well, that's up to you now." The weight of the old man's words hung heavy in the air as Frank and Mary stood there in the dimly lit antique store, the leather-bound book now lying between them like a key to the unknown. They had been on this journey together for so long, piecing together fragments of a puzzle that didn't seem to fit. But this? This was something different. The room seemed to shrink as Frank turned the pages of the book, his fingers trembling slightly. The symbol, the eagle, wings spread wide, was there, etched into the parchment, its image mirrored by other intricate symbols. But it was more than just a design, the history surrounding it was ancient, shrouded in darkness, and steeped in mystery. "Do you understand any of this?" Mary asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She was standing close, her eyes scanning the pages with a mix of fascination and fear. Frank didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing. The pages told a story of power, secrecy, and betrayal. The symbol wasn't just some emblem, it was a mark of an old, secretive order, one whose reach had extended throughout history. And that order had its fingers in everything: politics, crime, even law enforcement. Frank could feel the pieces clicking together in his mind, but the picture they formed was far from comforting. "This isn't just a symbol," Frank said, his voice thick with disbelief. "It's an order, an organization. A shadow network that's been pulling strings for centuries." Mary looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and concern. "But why us? Why did they target us?" Frank turned to the old man, whose face had grown even more somber. "We've done what they wanted. We found the symbol. But there's still one question left: why? Why are they after us?" The old man hesitated, clearly reluctant to speak any further. But Frank could see the fear in his eyes. fear that matched their own. The symbol you found, it's not meant to be discovered, the man said slowly. It's not a relic. It's a key to something much, much darker. Frank leaned in. A key to what? The old man shook his head. I don't know all the details. But I know that the symbol is connected to a very powerful group. A group that will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. They have eyes everywhere, people in positions of power, people you'd never suspect. And they're watching you. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. Frank swallowed hard, trying to digest what he was hearing. We need to get out of here, Mary whispered, her voice trembling. This isn't just about us anymore. We're in too deep. The old man nodded gravely. The people behind this aren't afraid to do whatever it takes to keep their secrets safe. You can't trust anyone, not even the police. Frank stood up abruptly, his mind whirling. But there has to be something we can do. We can't just walk away from this. The old man's expression grew even more solemn. You're already walking into something that will change your lives forever. And there's no going back. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant sound of footsteps approaching. Frank's heart skipped a beat as he glanced toward the door. Someone was coming. The old man quickly stepped back behind the counter, his eyes flashing with urgency. Go now. They're here. Before Frank could react, the door creaked open, and two figures stepped inside. Frank's pulse quickened as he recognized one of them, the officer. But this time, he wasn't alone. The second figure was a man Frank didn't recognize, but he exuded a dangerous aura. He was tall, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. You should have listened to the warning, the officer said, his tone dark and foreboding. You've made a mistake, Frank. The officer's words sent a chill through Frank. He had trusted this man, believed that he was someone on their side. But now, standing before him, Frank realized just how wrong he had been. The officer wasn't here to help them, he was here to silence them. The new man, the one Frank didn't recognize, stepped forward. We don't like people poking around in places they don't belong, he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. You should have stayed away. But now, you've forced our hand. Mary stepped back, her eyes wide with terror. Who are you? She demanded, her voice trembling. The man's lips curled into a cold smile. I am someone who has been watching you. And now, you've crossed the line. You're in way over your heads. Frank's mind raced. This was it. The final confrontation. The end of the road. He had no choice but to act. He couldn't let them take Mary. He couldn't let them win. Without thinking, he grabbed the book from the counter and held it out in front of him, as though it were a shield. You'll have to kill us to get it, he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through his veins. The officer and the man exchanged a glance, and for a moment, Frank thought they might back down. But then, the officer reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. Not necessary, the officer said, his eyes narrowing. This is how it ends, Frank. Frank's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen in place. He knew this was a game he couldn't win. Not with force. Not with violence. His only chance was to outsmart them, to find a way to escape, before it was too late. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, a glimmer of movement. The old man had disappeared behind the shelves, and now Frank saw him, standing by a back door, his face a mask of determination. It was a silent plea. A chance to run. A chance to survive. In that moment, everything clicked into place. The officer, the symbol, the bikers, it was all part of a larger plan, a dark and twisted conspiracy. The old man knew the truth, and he had a way out. Without a second thought, Frank grabbed Mary's hand and bolted toward the back door. Behind them, he could hear the officers' shouts, the sound of footsteps chasing them, but Frank didn't look back. He could feel the weight of everything they had uncovered, the danger, the darkness, but he couldn't let it end here. They burst through the door into the alleyway behind the shop. The cool night air hit their faces, and for a moment, Frank felt free. But he knew that wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. They had uncovered the truth, but the real fight was just beginning. The shadowy figures who had been pulling the strings weren't going to let them go easily. And now, Frank and Mary had no choice but to run, to survive. They would have to face the darkness head-on.